Journalist Trevor Paglen takes a look at the secret world of U.S. military patches. They often signify classified projects and operations. He explains several of these patches at this event from the Melville House in Brooklyn. It's 50 Minutes.
Thank you guys very much for having me. Thanks for coming out. And thank you, Dennis and Kelly, everybody here at Melville House for hosting this and for promoting the book and putting it out. I think they did a fantastic job. I'm very, very happy with it. So, the book is called I Could Tell You, but then you would have to be destroyed by me, Emblems from the Pentagon's Black World. And I think to start to get into the meat of the book, first we need a little bit of context. And so the place where I want to start our story today is the Antelope Valley. And the Antelope Valley is in Southern California, in the kind of westernmost part of the Mojave Desert. And this region has long been home to advanced aerospace projects, classified aerospace projects. At the center of the valley is Edwards Air Force Base, which is kind of made famous in the film The Right Stuff, with Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier, these sorts of things. Several years later, the first rocket plane would fly there. When the space shuttle Columbia landed from its first flight to space, it would land on the dry lake at Edwards Air Force Base. So this is a region that has a very, very rich and long history. It's a kind of military flight test area. Now, it's not just flight test that happens there, but a lot of production happens there. In the southern part of the Antelope Valley is a place called Plant 42, which is where Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Rockwell, major aerospace companies have their headquarters there. They design and develop lots of projects. Now, in the corners and the recesses of the Antelope Valley, there are hints to another kind of world that is happening here at the same time. You find kind of obscure radar ranges and restricted parts of the valley where you're not quite sure what's going on in there. You find these strange radar installations, and dishes, and that sort of thing. And some of these landscapes speak to a subset of this world of aerospace development, engineering, and testing, which is classified projects, working on black projects, as they call them, in the military. So I've spent a lot of time hanging around the people that build these aircraft, who have flown them, who've worked on them, people who've pumped the gas, people who've spent their lives working in this community. And one of the things that, as I've interviewed people over the years, that I've always tended to find is that there'll be a place in their house that looks something like this. They'll always have a study or a kind of a room where they have artifacts from the different projects that they've worked on. And I always thought this was kind of interesting. I never took it that seriously. But people were always eager to show me things like a mug, Have Blue Team, things like a hat like this where it says Cobra Judy, or different paperweights with kind of weird insignias on them, or desk models showing various aircraft or different unmanned aerial vehicles, this sort of thing. And people tend to have huge collections of patches. And people would really take care of these and frame them, and it was significant, this material was, to people that were working on these projects. Now, patches have a very, very long history in the military. It kind of goes back to the Civil War, really, is where the system of modern unit insignia comes from. And the kind of story that's told is about a guy here named General Philip Kearny. And legend holds that during the Civil War, one day he was walking along and he found two officers that were kind of lounging under a tree, wasting time. And he assumed that the officers were part of his own command. And so he went up to them and started screaming at them. Why were they loafing around? Why weren't they doing their job and this sort of thing? They kind of stood there quietly, taking this general's insults and abuse. And finally they kind of raised their hand and said, excuse me, sir, I think we're actually not part of your unit. And then the story goes that Kearney then turned around and he said, "Oh, I'm totally sorry." He turned into a model gentleman and he said, "I'll take steps to ensure that I don't confuse people who are not part of my command anymore." And so he ordered that everybody in his unit would put this red diamond on their uniform, on their cap, so that he could recognize all the officers in his own unit. And this caught on. The enlisted people followed suit, and they were proud to be a part of his group. So they also took to wearing this Kearney patch as it became known. And this system of insignia then spread throughout the entire military. Within a couple of years, you had people wearing trefoils, stars, all sorts of things like that. And there's a funny story about, as the armies from the east were kind of making their way to the west, they were kind of finding the people who were on the outskirts of the war a little bit. And there's a very funny story where when the 12th Corps went to Chattanooga to aid the 15th Corps, an Irish soldier from the latter division joined some of the newly arrived men around the campfire. And he noticed that all the men were wearing stars on their uniforms, and he asked if they were all brigadier generals. And the men said, no, these are our corps badges. And he said, "What's your corps badge?" And the Irish soldier apparently turned around and said, 40 rounds in the cartridge box and 20 in the pocket. And that then became the emblem for the 15th Corps. So this has a long, long history, and it, of course, continues to this day. If you've ever hung around the military or been in the military yourself, you know that there are patches and insignia for everything, for what rank you are, what unit you're attached to, what projects you've worked on, and that sort of thing. And it turns out that they also make patches and insignia for black projects, projects that don't exist. Now, where do these black projects come from? What is a black project? I think a good place to look, if you want to understand what a black project is and where they come from, is in the defense budget. So the Constitution has a thing in there called the Receipts and Expenditures Clause, which says that the government has to publish an accounting every year of all the money that they spend. And so this means that you can go to the website for the Department of Defense and download the budget each year. And when you do that, this is kind of what it's supposed to look like. This is a line item for $12.3 million. Description: provides unit and field service equipment to enhance soldier efficiency, effectiveness, and sustainability. Items include laundries, latrines, and showers, which directly affect combat readiness and sustain combat power by promoting wellness and preventing disease. This is the budget for toilets for the year. And the justification is these toilets are going to help us be more combat ready by promoting wellness and preventing disease. And the language is kind of funny, but this is what the budget is supposed to look like. Now, if you look at a different part of the budget, this is the budget for what they call research, development, test, and evaluations programs. It looks a little bit different. You start to find weird things in here, something called pilot fish, with a budget of $133 million. Retract larch, $89 million. Retract juniper, what's this, $27 million. It goes on and on like this, these strange code names, each representing millions of dollars. They have no justifications attached to them. Other kinds of projects, for example, special activities, has no number at all associated with it. Selected activities, again, we have a blank spot in the ledger here. Advanced geospatial intelligence, foreign counterintelligence, combined advanced applications, HUMINT, classified programs, special programs. We have entire agencies whose budget is a blank spot in the ledger. We have the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which is an agency which is close to my heart. This is the Pentagon's geography department, as it were. It's significantly, has significantly better funding than the geography department at Berkeley. This is the National Security Agency. Again, most of the budget is a giant blank spot in the ledger. There's a funny thing that you can do with this budget document, which is you can go through each of the line items and add them up by hand. And it takes a while, and you have to be a little bit obsessive compulsive. But when you do that, you get a number. And if you compare that to the published total, you'll find that there's a discrepancy. The discrepancy is about $30 billion. And that $30 billion is the very kind of rough estimate of what they call the black budget. Now, this black budget translates, it doesn't disappear into the universe somehow. It creates jobs, it creates spaces. And you can see this black budget and these black projects reflected in people's resumes. Kind of going back to the Antelope Valley, you can start to find all kinds of people whose resumes and biographies have blank spots that are similar to those blank spots we saw in the budget. There's tons and tons of people who work on these projects. There's about 4 million people in the country who have security clearances to work on classified projects. And so we're going to look at one pilot here as an example. But again, this is a typical example. There's nothing particularly remarkable about his CV compared to other people's. This is a guy named Joseph Lanny. At the time that this biography was published, he's a colonel. He's since been promoted to a brigadier general. But there's some interesting stuff in here. He said, as a command pilot, he has more than 4,300 flying hours and over 70 different types of aircraft, including the FA-22 and numerous classified prototypes. So he's flown numerous classified aircraft. Now that's interesting. August 1992 to January 1994, Assistant Operations Officer, 6513th Test Squadron at Edwards Air Force Base. This is a very, very interesting squadron, as it turns out. There's a squadron called the Red Hats. Their symbol is more with less. And what the Red Hats do is they fly a collection of former Soviet Union fighters. They fly MiGs. And they fly them out of Area 51 in Nevada, this kind of secret base out there. This is a photo of a MiG-21. So one of them flying. So it's a classified unit, 6513th. Now he's got some other stuff in his resume. From 1995 to 1997, he was the commander of a classified flight test squadron. So you have classified aircraft. You have to have classified squadrons of pilots to fly those aircraft. And here's the patch of this classified flight test squadron that he commanded. It does not have a unit number. The unit has no unit designation. So it's called the Special Projects Flight Test Squadron. And there's some interesting symbols in the patch here that help us understand what's going on here. First of all, on the left side of the patch, we have a collection of 5 stars and 1 off to the side. It's in Area 51. This is where this unit flies. We have this wizard who's holding a sigma symbol. That sigma symbol represents invisibility. Like in the engineering language of stealth, this is the ideal that you want to achieve. You want to create a radar invisible aircraft, which is represented by this symbol. On the right-hand side, you see a ball falling from the sky. And what that represents is an aluminum ball that they drop from the sky to calibrate radars on the ground. So you drop something from the sky where you know what the radar cross-section of it is supposed to be, and you're able to calibrate your radar that way. Again, we have this radar. On the bottom left-hand side, we have a generic aircraft on the right-hand side. And we have this peculiar sword here. We're going to come back to that sword a little bit later. So what else does his biography tell us? He was the commander of a classified flight test squadron. And he became the vice commander of Detachment 3 of the Air Force Flight Test Center in Las Vegas, Nevada. Detachment 3 of the Air Force Flight Test Center is Area 51, the secret base in Nevada. That is, it's in the middle of a place called the Nellis Range, which is a military range about the size of Switzerland. And within that range, there's something that people call the box. And the box is a place that you're not supposed to go into. You know, if you're a fighter pilot doing exercises, even in the Nellis Range, it's a place you're not allowed to land there. Nobody who doesn't have a top secret clearance and a need to know is allowed to go there. Now, aircraft flown. This is all the aircraft he's flown. F-4, F-5, F-15. These are all standard aircraft. But here at the end, there's something interesting. It says he's flown something called the YF-24. Now, there's no such thing as the YF-24 in the white world, as we call it. But yet this is not a typo. Could this be the YF-24? I don't know. But I know that this patch has something to do with this man's career. He's conducted the first flights of 2 classified prototype aircraft. What could that be? Well, again, we don't know. But here are the patches for 4 classified prototype aircraft who remain classified to this day. On the left we have a project called Minotaur. Second from the left we have Northrop Night Stalker 2. Well, that's interesting. That implies a Night Stalker 1. I don't know what that is. And we have this patch with the eagle holding the sword. And on the far right we have something called Advanced Technology Observation Platform. And the Latin there translates as vigilance through stealth. So, oftentimes, as we saw with that Special Projects Flight Test Squadron patch, there are little clues in the patch that speak to the purpose of these classified units or these classified programs. You remember the sword that we saw in the Special Projects Flight Test Squadron patch. Well, that showed up on this patch in the mid-1990s. A friend of mine saw somebody wearing it at Edwards Air Force Base and went up to the guy and said, "Hey, what's this bird of prey? I never heard of bird of prey before." And apparently the guy turned around and said, "Well, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you." But what bird of prey is depicted in the patch. Now, bird of prey has become one of 3 airplanes that have been declassified since the late 1970s. It was declassified in 2002. And when they declassified the airplane, this is what it looked like. So the shape of the aircraft was the same shape as the handle on the sword. With black projects, there are often things like this going on. This is a patch from the National Reconnaissance Office. Has anybody actually heard of the National Reconnaissance Office here? Nobody, okay. Well, it turns out the United States has 2 space agencies. And you may have heard of one called NASA, right? Send people to the moon, this kind of thing. Well, there's this other space agency, which is almost as old as NASA, called the National Reconnaissance Office. And then the existence of the National Reconnaissance Office wasn't made public until 1992. So for about 30 years, we had a secret space agency, the existence of it was secret. Now, we know that the National Reconnaissance Office exists now, but everything that they do is still classified. So this patch shows up in 2000, and it's interesting because it says, "We own the night," and this symbol of these owl eyes seems to have something to do with seeing at night. Now, if you are in the business of building spy satellites, it's hard to imagine how you're able to see at night. If anybody's a photographer, you know that it's unbelievably difficult to take a good picture at night. Now imagine that you're in a spacecraft orbiting the Earth, traveling at thousands and thousands of miles per hour, trying to take a picture of at night of something on the ground. Almost impossible to do. I mean, in fact, with what we know of standard photographic techniques, it would be impossible. Well, the way that you can do that, however, is using something called a synthetic aperture radar, which is that you bounce radar waves off the surface of the Earth and collect them back. And the shape that those radar waves come back in create a picture of the surface of the Earth. This was famously used by a NASA spacecraft called Magellan that was sent out to Venus and was going to map the surface of Venus through the clouds. Now, the National Reconnaissance Office and NASA are kind of interesting in a way, in the sense that the National Reconnaissance Office kind of has secret versions of a lot of NASA spacecraft. So, for example, the Hubble telescope, which is in space kind of pointing out, looking at the depths of the universe. Well, it turns out that this Hubble is modeled on something called a KH-11 satellite, which is run by the National Reconnaissance Office. And there's many more of these KH-11s circling around the globe, but they're pointed down towards the Earth. Now, the funny thing about this patch is that it depicts a constellation of satellites. So reconnaissance satellites travel in groups. And it turned out that when this patch came out, that the orbital inclinations depicted on the patch were accurate for the constellation of spacecraft. And I was able to photograph this Lacrosse or Onyx spacecraft from the roof of my house in Berkeley. This is another one. Lately, the National Reconnaissance Office has been using the names of constellations to refer to the payloads of their launches. And so this one came out in 2007, June 15th. The National Reconnaissance Office launched a satellite on top of an Atlas V from Florida. Now, the patch shows a high inclination orbit around the Earth. The ship kind of indicates perhaps a Navy mission. We have 2 stars on each side of the patch, and then we have this constellation. The constellation Pyxis is in the southern hemisphere. Now, it turns out that this probably refers to something called a naval, ocean, and surveillance satellite. What it is, it's a naval satellite that tracks ships moving across the oceans of the world. And there's a couple of symbols here that refer to that. Obviously, we have the ship, we have an orbital inclination that would be consistent with this kind of satellite, and then we have the 2 stars on either side of the patch. And it turns out that these satellites travel in twos, right? They travel in twos. And here the Latin comes from Seneca the Younger, and it says, the trip from the Earth to the stars is not an easy one. And here is a photo of these naval ocean surveillance satellites traveling towards the Andromeda galaxy in the night sky. In addition to patches, you find other kinds of artifacts, as we saw at the beginning of the talk. You have mugs, hats. You have the memorial coins as well. So they often make coins to commemorate anniversaries or special projects, that sort of thing. And one of the coins that I got my hands on is something called black hats. And we have this kind of dog Latin, excellent communication, or something like that. And we have some symbols here on the right-hand side that we're familiar with already. So we have this collection of 5 stars and 1. We know what that means. Then we have, on either side of this cloud, we have the shape of 2 stealth aircraft. So on the left-hand side, we have a F-117A stealth fighter. On the right-hand side, we have a stealth bomber. Now we have a cloud with eyes and a lightning bolt coming out of it. And that often means, in the kind of symbolic language of these patches, it means something about electronic warfare. A red star at the bottom, if we had to take a guess, it would be a good guess that might represent stolen Soviet hardware, some Soviet hardware, something involving that. Now, this shape on the top of the cloud is a mystery. What could it mean? Well, it could be a black hat itself, although that's not so convincing to me. Perhaps it represents the shape of an aircraft that remains classified. We don't know. Now, it says established 1966. So this Black Hats unit was established in 1966. Now, I know a lot of guys that worked out here at Area 51 in the 1960s, and I've shown this coin to quite a few of them, asking about what this Black Hats unit might be, and I've gotten 2 answers to that question. Sometimes I've shown it to someone and they said, black hats, never heard of black hats before. The other answer I've gotten, I've shown it to someone and say, black hats. I've never heard of black hats before. Again, the kind of material culture of this world happens in all kinds of ways. It turns out they have football leagues and baseball leagues in this black world where different units compete against each other. And so they make rings and things like that for one another. We're familiar with this unit here, the red hats, more with less. You remember them. On the right-hand side, we have the familiar collection of 5 stars in 1, again, red hats. Then we have BHAS. And what could that mean? Well, it turns out what that means is blue hats ain't she. And apparently the blue hats are another black unit that these guys compete against. Now the unit, this collection of stars that we see on the right-hand side shows up in a number of places. One of the other places that it shows up is in the cockpit of this aircraft. I mentioned that 3 aircraft have been declassified since the late 70s. One we saw Bird of Prey, another one was called Have Blue, and then there was this one, which is called Tacit Blue. And inside the cockpit of Tacit Blue, we find this. You see, we find that same symbol that we saw in the football ring from the Red Hats squadron. So again, there are these symbols that appear in all sorts of different places. Now, one of the things that interests me about these symbols and these patches is that it turns out that there's a very, very long history in art of trying to represent that which cannot be represented. Right? So this is usually something that happens in religious art or Freemasonry, Scientology. They all have elaborate symbols surrounding their religion or the cult or whatever it is that speak to the mysteries at this religion, to the truths that only insiders have access to. So when we look at the ancient Roman world, we have for example, the Mithraic Mysteries, which was a kind of Roman mystery cult. There were a number of mystery cults around the time of the Roman Empire, and this one was primarily composed of soldiers in the Roman army. Now, nobody really knows what the central mysteries were of the cult of Mithraism or the Mithraic Mysteries. And all we have are these artifacts. We have these elaborate images on frescoes and drawn into the sides of caves and temples and statues and this sort of thing. But a scholar who was at Berkeley for a while, a guy named David Ulansey, was looking at all of this artwork, and he realized that what it represented were star charts. And what we had here, for example, this snake, and we had, here's the constellation Perseus, and he's slitting the throat of a bull. And what he kind of theorized was that what they had figured out was the precession of the equinoxes, and what the visual language symbolized was the end of the age of Taurus, right? Perseus slitting the bull's throat. Now, this posited, in the worldview at the time, this meant that there must be a God outside of the heavens itself, who was more powerful than any god that was known about at the time, who was able to move the stars themselves. And that would be something that would be very fitting to have at the heart of a mystery religion. But we find this kind of thing in not just in the Mithraic mysteries, we find this in early Christianity. For example, this ichthys was an acronym for, I'm going to butcher the Greek here, Iseos Christos Theo Ios Soter, which means Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, right? And if you saw this graffiti and you were a Christian, you would recognize it, but if you weren't, it would be meaningless to you. Another very kind of famous symbol from Christianity is the fish, which of course has all kinds of references, in the New Testament. And apparently, when Christianity was still illegal, what would happen is if you were walking down the street and you saw somebody who might be a Christian, you would draw a half of this fish, like in the dirt or something like that, with a stick. And if the other person completed the symbol, then you knew that they were also a Christian. And if they didn't complete it, you knew that they weren't. So again, it was a symbol that if you were on the inside of it, it meant something to you. If you were on the outside, it meant nothing to you. And of course, we have the symbolism is pervasive in our culture when we pay attention to it. You have to look no further than the back of a dollar bill, and you'll find all kinds of symbols. Now, so these patches and these artifacts from this world speak to something about the programs, about the units that they represent, units whose existence is classified. But I think they also speak to something about the culture of these black projects. You have to imagine these are people who are working on these projects can't talk to their families about what they're doing. It's very, very kind of alienating to not be able to tell the world what you do for a living. And so I think that's reflected in a number of these as well. We have patches here like a lifetime of silence behind the green door. And of course, the green door is traditionally a kind of symbol for a place where something secret goes on, it's something forbidden is behind the green door. It's obviously most famous from a pornographic film from the 1970s, where there was a green door, and behind this green door was some kind of sex club. And then we have this phantom character holding a dagger, and we have a star here in the southwest and another star in the sky. And I believe that this patch is worn by people who control classified satellites from the ground in Colorado. This was one of Caligula's favorite sayings. This one says, "Let them hate so long as they fear." 10-cap special applications. What this stands for is kind of using reconnaissance satellites for tactical missions. Reconnaissance satellites are typically used to have a strategic function, to like map the battle space of a war, for example. So a tactical application would involve getting real-time information from satellites to help you win a battle. This is a funny one. Classified flight test. In the bottom here it says, "Tastes like chicken." And we have a stealth bomber that's being eaten by some kind of alien. You might recognize that sigma symbol, again, representing invisibility. And 509 refers to the 509th Bombing Wing, who fly B-2 stealth bombers. But the lineage of this unit goes back to Roswell, New Mexico in 1947, where legend holds that some UFOs crashed there. And so part of this unit's lineage, sometimes they make fun of this alien story that's associated with them. Now, this patch, it turns out, turned into a little bit of a debacle. Some general saw this and got really upset and said, "You can't say classified flight test on the patch." And so the guys in the unit were forced to change it. And this is what they came up with. "To serve man." This one speaks for itself. I think this may represent, I know that it represents a reconnaissance satellite. It's unclear exactly which one it does represent. But if it represents the one I think it does, this is a picture of this spacecraft taken from the roof of my house. This is a funny one. We have this black world, right, depicted in the patch. And the Latin translates here as doing God's work with other people's money. Now, this is the patch that the book takes its title from. It's a black patch. There's no information in it at all. And one of the Latin translations you can make from it is, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. Black patch. It's actually a little bit more interesting than that, though. It turns out that Latin is written in the passive voice. So a more correct translation is, I could tell you, but then you would have to be destroyed by me. And this is a weird way to write. And what happens, however, if you write this way in Latin, two references pop out in the passive voice that don't appear in the active voice. One is this word Eris, which is a reference to the Greek goddess of chaos and strife. Now, by phrasing it this way, you also reference another famous saying from Roman history, where a Roman senator would go around to the Roman Senate saying, "Carthago delenda est." Carthage must be destroyed. This was Cato the Elder that would say this. And he finally got his wish. He was able to convince the Roman Senate to go after Carthage, which was this city in North Africa, in present-day Tunisia. And supposedly the Roman army went into Carthage and burnt the whole city to the ground, killed all the men, enslaved all the women, and then legend holds that the army went through the city pouring salt into the ground so that nothing would ever grow there again. So there's a very rich reference in that Latin, in the passive voice there. Here's a classic in the genre. Don't ask, none of your freaking business. And this was worn by transport crews who were charged with flying to Southern California and picking up classified airframes and bringing them to Nevada for flight testing. One of the things that a lot of people ask about this project is why, if you have this black world and you have all these projects that supposedly don't exist, why do you make patches for them in the first place? Why do you advertise the fact that you're doing this? And I'm not sure that I've ever gotten a completely convincing answer about that, but I think there's something kind of cultural going on here. You have to remember that this is a very, very alienating world to be a part of. You know, again, imagine going to work somewhere and you can't tell your family what you do for a living, can't tell them how your day was, maybe you can't even tell where you went to work that day. And so I think that by creating these kinds of patches, it's a way to ameliorate that sense of alienation a little bit. I think it's a way that people can see their own work externally somehow, have a souvenir from this work when they retire from it. And people take a lot of pride in these patches and take a lot of pride in this work that they can't talk about. But it's not universal. It's not universal in the sense that there are a lot of people, I think, who work in this world who have a very, very hard time with it, and a lot of people who kind of crack under the pressure of going through these very, very rigorous security measures and this kind of alienation. One guy that I showed some of these patches to, who was a guy who was trying to get out of this black world, trying to stop doing this kind of work, I showed him some patches and he said, "Yeah, I've seen those things before. Those are gang colors." So thank you very much for having me today, and we'll take any questions you might have.
Again, if I could just ask you to wait until you get a microphone in front of you, or if you would stand up to ask your question, so that the people watching this at home. Thank you.
Do you have a favorite patch, or is there a patch that you feel is incredibly well executed?
I really like the patch with the dragon whose wings are spread out and then his wings are the American flag. To me, that says a lot. I like that patch.
Did you meet any of the designers or people who execute on these, and how that relationship goes between the thinking of the symbols and working with the units?
Yeah, I have talked to some of the people who have designed these patches, and they think quite a lot about it. Everything is there for a reason, you know, and it's they're very, very creative people who design these things. And I think there's a lot of people out there who are very talented artists who never went to art school or did something like that, and so I think sometimes that creativity is expressed in these patches.
Are they part of the units, or they're like?
Yeah, they're part of the units. Yeah, typically, yeah. So the way is that there's several kinds of patches. So there'll be unit patches, and someone in the unit will design that. You know, for a black unit, it doesn't go through exactly the same chain of command, so it doesn't have to get approved at the highest level. The other kinds of patches that you see are what's called Friday patches. And those are patches that a unit will design for themselves to use instead of the patch that's issued to them by the military. And there's kind of a tradition that you're allowed to wear the patch you created for yourself on Fridays. So some of the patches that we see here are these Friday patches as well.
Trevor, as you've researched this, have you met with any hostility in your questioning, and are people pretty open to your
No, I think
questioning?
people are very proud of this work. You know, this is a significant part of American history, I think, that hasn't been told in large measure, and so I think I've never met hostility in terms of doing this. I think people are happy to talk about it. It's just there are obviously things that they can't talk about, but.
Well, what about the guy whose career you've been tracing? I wonder if you've heard
Well, I
from
just,
him.
you know, again, that's I kind of arbitrarily took that biography off the website at Edwards Air Force Base. So I haven't talked to him in particular. I just kind of used his biography to show this this lineage a little bit.
Is there a significance to the mark on the cover? And if not, how did you design that, and what is that?
I actually did not design it. I'm not sure if there's a significance to it or not. I think maybe Kelly can answer that.
I had a question about the patch with the dragon that you said you liked, which looked like it had a diamond underneath.
Yeah, it had its tail wrapped around a diamond. And I ended up, there is a code word in the kind of world of reconnaissance satellites, or it's an information compartment that is something like Byman Improved Crystal Dragon. And when I saw that code word, I thought, okay, well here we have a dragon, we have a crystal, so maybe this patch is associated with that project somehow, which I believe was the infrared imaging capability on a KH-11 spacecraft. I'm not sure how accurate. I'm not sure whether that's right or not, whether the patch actually depicts that or not, but it's kind of a coincidence.
And isn't that an I Ching symbol on the cover?
I don't know, I'm sorry.
Hi, your book on extraordinary rendition, I'm guessing you probably encountered a few folks in the black world. Did that dovetail at all with this project?
No, in fact, quite the opposite. This project is kind of an offshoot of a larger project that I've been working on for a number of years, and the rendition project was also an offshoot of that project as well. So I've been looking at this world of secrecy and kind of secret geographies for quite some time, and over the course of looking at that world, I started keeping files on this rendition program, and eventually got to the point where I had enough files on that topic that it seemed important to just have it be its own project. So. Okie doke. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Trevor Paglen is an independent journalist whose work has appeared in Wired and the New York Review of Books. He is co-author with A.C. Thompson of Torture Taxi: On the Trail of the CIA's Rendition Flights. For more information, visit